Diego had spent the last 12 hours on his feet, grinding through another exhausting shift. The weight of fatigue clung to him like a second skin. But as he finally turned onto his street, relief began to seep in. Home. A place of rest, of comfort. But something was wrong. A sharp, acrid scent cut through the air the moment he rolled down his window. At first, he dismissed it as a neighbor grilling late into the evening. That was until he saw it, the eerie glow flickering against his windshield, dancing across the hood of his car in ominous waves of orange and red. His heart stuttered. The fire wasn't from a barbecue. It was coming from his house. Panic surged through him like an electric current. Diego barely threw his car into park before bolting out, his breath catching in his throat as the full scene unfolded before him. Flames licked hungrily at the right side of his home, consuming everything in their path. Thick, black smoke curled upward, staining the night sky. The wooden panels of his house crackled and split apart under the relentless heat. Then he saw her. Anna, his next-door neighbor, stood a few feet away from the blaze, her posture unnervingly casual for someone witnessing an inferno. But it wasn't just her presence that sent ice rushing through his veins. It was what she was holding. A gas can. The firelight cast eerie shadows across her face, making her expression unreadable. But Diego caught it, just a flicker of something in her eyes. Amusement. Satisfaction. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the canister, her knuckles turning ghostly white, as if daring him to question her. Diego's mind spun, his thoughts a tangled mess of disbelief and fury. He struggled to find his voice, to make sense of what he was seeing. Finally, he managed to force out the words, his voice hoarse and edged with something dangerously close to rage. "What the hell are you doing?" Anna tilted her head, almost as if she were considering his question, before offering him a slow, deliberate smirk. "You don't belong here," she said, her tone so eerily calm it sent a shiver down his spine. "I'm just solving the problem." His stomach dropped. The problem? The realization hit him like a freight train. She wasn't just some bystander caught in the chaos. She was the cause of it. "You're burning down my house," Diego whispered, his own voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. Anna didn't flinch. If anything, her smirk deepened. "I'm doing what needs to be done," she said with a nonchalant shrug, as if she were discussing trimming a hedge rather than committing arson. Diego's body went rigid. Every memory, every cherished piece of his life that existed within those four walls, it was all turning to ash before his eyes. And she was standing there, watching it happen like it was nothing. Then, before Diego could move, before he could even think to reach for his phone or scream for help, Anna did something unthinkable. She pulled out her phone and dialed 911. Diego stood frozen, the heat from the flames scorching his skin. But it was nothing compared to the fire burning inside him. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, trying to understand how Anna, his neighbor, the woman who had lived next door for years, could stand there with a gas can in her hand, watching his house burn, and then have the audacity to call 911. And then she did it. "Help!" Anna screamed into the phone, her voice shrill, cracking with perfectly manufactured terror. "Help me! There's a dangerous black man attacking me. He's threatening my life. Send officers, please, hurry!" Diego felt the blood drain from his face. His breath hitched in his throat. He had seen this act before too many times. The trembling voice, the quivering breath, the exaggerated distress. It was a role she had perfected, a script written long before tonight, one designed to turn him from the victim into the villain in an instant. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His home was burning, his world collapsing, and yet here she was, flipping reality on its head with the ease of someone who had done it before. The worst part? He knew how dangerous this game was. One wrong move, one misstep, and this entire situation could spiral out of control in a way that he might not walk away from. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Not this time. Diego reached into his pocket, fingers fumbling for his phone. His hands trembled, but not from fear, no, this was something else. Rage. Indignation. A desperate, clawing need to expose the truth before it was too late. He hit record and lifted the phone, his voice eerily steady despite the fury bubbling beneath the surface. "Are you seriously calling the cops on me while you're literally committing arson?" His tone was low, controlled, but there was an edge to it, a dangerous, simmering undertone that even he could hear. Anna ignored him, turning slightly, as if shielding herself from an imaginary attack. "Please. He's violent. I don't know what to do. Oh God, I think he's coming for me." Diego barked out a bitter laugh. "You're unbelievable," he muttered. But what Anna didn't realize, what she failed to consider in her arrogant confidence, was that she wasn't the only one being recorded. Across the street, porch lights flicked on, windows slid open. Neighbors, some still in their pajamas, others clutching their phones, had stepped outside to witness the chaos. A few just stared in shock, but others had their cameras up. Diego spotted Miss S. Carter, the elderly widow from 2 doors down, standing on her porch, her iPad clutched tightly in her wrinkled hands. Next to her, a young couple stood with their phones raised, shaking their heads. Further down the street, a teenage boy was live streaming the entire thing. Anna's performance continued, oblivious to her growing audience. "He's threatening me. He's trying to hurt me. I just told him he shouldn't be here. And he snapped. Please, just send someone fast." The fire crackled loudly behind her, consuming Diego's home, eating through walls. Memories, years of his life. And she was standing there, trying to turn him into the criminal, as if she hadn't just destroyed everything he owned. Diego let out a sharp breath, forcing himself to stay calm. His hands shook, but he kept the phone steady, capturing every single second. Because this time, justice wasn't going to slip away. This time, the truth wouldn't be drowned out by lies. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights flickered against the smoke-choked sky, painting the scene in a haunting glow. Anna didn't notice. Not yet. But she would soon. The sirens cut through the night like a blade, their wailing cry sending a shiver down Diego's spine. He didn't move. He didn't flinch. He only stood there, his phone steady in his grip, recording every single second. Anna, still caught in the fantasy of her performance, staggered backward as the first squad car screeched to a halt, its tires skidding against the pavement. Flashing red and blue lights painted her pale face in frantic bursts, illuminating the smirk that had long since vanished. Her expression twisted, shifting from rehearsed fear to something raw panic. 3 officers poured out, hands hovering near their holsters as they scanned the scene. The raging fire swallowing Diego's home, the gas can lying discarded near Anna's feet, the stunned neighbors, all holding their phones aloft like a jury gathering evidence in real time. For the first time, Anna hesitated. She had expected chaos, confusion, an immediate rush to restrain the dangerous black man she had so dramatically described. But something was wrong. The officers weren't storming toward Diego. Their eyes weren't locked onto him with suspicion. No, they were looking at her. More specifically, they were looking at the gas can she had tried to pretend wasn't there. Anna sucked in a sharp breath, and did the only thing she knew how to do. Double down. "Thank God you're here," she wailed, stumbling toward the officers, arms flailing wildly. "This man, he tried to attack me. He threatened me. Ma'am." The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a sharp, unreadable gaze, held up a hand. His voice was firm, controlled. "What's that in your hand?" Anna froze. She blinked, then followed his gaze down to her fingers, as if only now realizing she was still gripping the evidence of her own crime. "Oh," she stammered, her fingers twitching. "This? It's not mine. I don't know how it got there." Her voice cracked with forced innocence as she tossed the can to the ground, as though discarding it could erase the last 15 minutes. Diego let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He turned his phone slightly, ensuring every single moment was being recorded. "She set my house on fire," he said, his voice laced with fury barely kept in check. "And then she called you, hoping you'd arrest me for it." The officer's jaw tightened. He shifted his gaze to the gathering crowd. And then, one voice rang out, cutting through the tension like a razor blade. "We saw everything." A woman stepped forward from the sidewalk, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was still in her pajamas, her robe cinched at the waist, a phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her expression was one of disgust, her eyes burning with something Diego could only describe as righteous fury. "She was out here pouring gasoline all over the place before he even got home," the woman said sharply. "And when he pulled up, she called 911 and started screaming like she was the one in danger. It's all on video," someone else added. A young man, maybe 19, raised his phone. Live streamed the whole thing. More nods, more murmurs of agreement, more people stepping forward, holding up their devices, displaying the undeniable truth in high definition. Anna's face drained of color. The control she had clung to so desperately was slipping through her fingers, disintegrating faster than the flames behind her. The lead officer exhaled slowly, his patience worn thin. He took a step toward Anna, his stance shifting, his next words spoken with the weight of a decision already made. "So let me get this straight," he said, his tone clipped. "You set this man's house on fire and then called us, trying to blame him." Anna's mouth opened and closed, her mind clearly racing for an escape hatch that didn't exist. But the mask was cracking, her carefully crafted performance unraveling. And then it snapped completely. "Oh, please," she spat, the pretense of victimhood falling away, replaced by something uglier, something real. Her face twisted with contempt, her hands flung into the air as she shrieked. "He doesn't even deserve this house. He doesn't belong here. I was just fixing things." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the officers stiffened. Diego? He felt nothing but cold, simmering rage. Anna had played her hand. And now, she was going to lose everything. The wail of sirens grew deafening as squad cars skidded to a stop, their flashing lights slicing through the smoke-choked air. Doors flew open. Officers poured out, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes scanning the scene. The heat of the fire pulsed against their faces, illuminating the destruction still raging behind them. And then, Anna moved. She bolted toward them, arms flailing, breath coming in frantic, ragged sobs. "Thank God you're here," she cried, her voice breaking at just the right moments. "He's dangerous. He tried to attack me. I barely got away." Her desperation was palpable, dripping from every trembling word, every shuddering breath. To an untrained ear, she sounded like a woman barely escaping a nightmare. But the officers were not untrained. They didn't rush toward Diego. They didn't pull their weapons or bark commands at him. They didn't move at all, because they had already seen it. The gas can, still lying near Anna's feet. The flickering fire consuming Diego's home. The neighbors' phones raised, eyes burning with outrage. Anna faltered. The performance wavered. The lead officer, a man with a broad frame and a gaze sharp enough to cut through lies, took a measured step forward. "Ma'am, calm down," he ordered, voice clipped, professional. "No, you don't understand," she shrieked, gesturing wildly toward Diego. "I called you. I'm the victim. You called us while holding a gas can." His words sliced through her hysteria like a scalpel. Anna's mouth snapped shut. Her chest heaved. She blinked rapidly, searching for the script she had rehearsed in her mind, but it was gone. Burned away. The officer glanced at Diego, then at the sea of raised phones. "Anyone want to tell me what actually happened?" A dozen voices spoke at once. "She set his house on fire. We saw everything. She started screaming the second he pulled up. She called you because she thought you'd believe her." Anna whipped around, eyes darting to the neighbors, her neighbors, who had once shared polite nods and meaningless small talk with her. Now, they stared at her with nothing but disgust. The officer took another step forward, voice even, but unmistakably firm. "So let me get this straight. You committed arson, called 911 and tried to frame this man for your crime?" Silence. Anna's hands clenched into fists. "No, that's not." She swallowed hard, her face twisted, something venomous lurking beneath the panic. "He doesn't even belong here. Diego exhaled sharply. His fingers dug into his palms. The fire crackled louder behind him, like a beast feeding on the remains of his life. The officer's expression didn't change. No anger. No surprise. Just finality. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Anna's breath hitched. "Wait, what?" The officer pulled out his cuffs. "You're under arrest for arson, filing a false police report, and endangering lives." Panic set in. Real, visceral panic. "No, no, no," she shrieked, stepping back. "I called you. You can't do this to me. He's the criminal. She never finished the sentence. The second she jerked backward, her arm swung wildly, and her palm collided with the officer's face. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the fire seemed to still for a moment. The officer barely reacted. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkening, but he remained unnervingly calm. Anna's expression twisted in horror as she realized what she had done. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, no. Assaulting an officer," he said, voice like ice. "Add that to your charges." And then, before she could run, before she could protest, before she could do anything at all, they grabbed her. Anna shrieked as she was spun around, her arms wrenched behind her back, the cold bite of steel snapping around her wrists. "No," she howled, thrashing. "You can't do this to me." But the officers weren't listening anymore. The truth had already been told. Anna's screams tore through the night, raw and desperate, but no one moved to help her. No one flinched. The officers held her firm, their grips unyielding as she thrashed, her once pristine composure shattering into frantic, incoherent pleas. The fire behind them raged on, casting eerie shadows across her pale, sweat-slicked face. But the flames weren't the only thing consuming her now. Her own lies were devouring her whole. Please, you don't understand," she sobbed, struggling against the handcuffs, her voice losing its false bravado. "I was doing the right thing. He doesn't belong here. I was just, enough." The lead officer's voice was sharp, final. He wasn't interested in her excuses. He didn't need them. The truth had already been laid bare. The crowd of neighbors stood like silent witnesses. their expressions ranging from disgust to satisfaction. Miss S. Carter, the elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, shook her head in quiet disapproval. The teenage boy with the live stream muttered, "Damn," under his breath, shaking his head. Even the couple who had only moved in last summer, who barely knew Diego, stared at Anna with something close to horror. No one was coming to her defense, because there was nothing left to defend. Diego watched it all unfold, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been prepared for the worst. For the disbelief. For the suspicion. He had seen it too many times before, where the truth didn't matter, where the narrative had already been decided before the facts could even be spoken. But this time, the evidence spoke louder than any lie Anna could conjure. His hands trembled at his sides, not with fear, but with the weight of it all. His home was still burning. The life he had built reduced to embers. But in this moment, as he watched Anna struggle against the reality she had created, he felt something unexpected. Vindication. "You nearly killed me," he said, his voice quiet but cutting through the chaos like a blade. "And you thought you could just lie your way out of it. Like you always do." Anna's wild eyes snapped to his. There was no remorse there, no understanding, only fury that her world had crumbled in real time. "You don't get it," she hissed, her voice raw. "People like you, people like me?" Diego cut her off, stepping closer. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "People like me are done being silent." The officer tightened the cuffs around her wrists. "Let's go." Anna's mouth opened, but no more words came. Just a strangled, broken sound as the officers hauled her toward the waiting squad car. The reality of her fate crashed over her like a tidal wave. For the first time that night, she truly understood. She had lost. Anna's breathing came in ragged gasps as the officers pulled her toward the squad car. Her once carefully orchestrated performance had unraveled completely, leaving only raw, unfiltered panic. "No, no, no," she shrieked, her heels digging into the pavement, body twisting violently as she tried to break free. "You can't do this. I called you. I'm the victim." The officers didn't flinch. They had heard it all before. Anna's struggles grew wilder, her body flailing in a last-ditch attempt to regain control. But the officers moved with swift efficiency, their grips like iron. One of them muttered under his breath, shaking his head, "Bad move." Diego watched from a few feet away, his fists still clenched at his sides, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. His home was still burning, the fire casting grotesque shadows against the pavement. But his focus remained locked on the woman who had tried to ruin him. And now, she was coming apart at the seams. Anna thrashed violently, throwing her weight from side to side. Desperate, animalistic. "I'll have your jobs for this. Do you hear me? I know people." The lead officer let out a sigh, clearly unimpressed. "Ma'am, you need to calm down," Anna snapped. She twisted sharply, her hands still locked in cuffs, and lunged, her shoulder slamming into the officer's chest, sending him staggering back a step. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. Then everything happened at once. 3 officers descended on her, pinning her against the hood of the squad car with practiced precision. Her scream turned into a strangled, furious shriek as she kicked out blindly, her body writhing against their hold. Gravel scraped against her cheek as they pressed her down, her once pristine blouse now wrinkled and smeared with dirt. "You're hurting me," she wailed, her voice breaking into sobs. "This is police brutality." One officer let out an exasperated breath. "Lady, you just assaulted law enforcement." Another officer clicked his radio. "Dispatch, suspect is resisting arrest. We need immediate backup." Anna thrashed harder, her blonde hair tangled and wild, her breath coming in heaving sobs. "You can't do this to me. I'm not the criminal he is." She twisted her head, her bloodshot eyes locking onto Diego. "This is his fault. This is all his fault." Diego didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The entire neighborhood was watching. The officers weren't listening. Justice had already decided its course. With a final desperate wail, Anna's resistance gave out. Her body sagged, her voice dissolving into whimpering, unintelligible pleas. The fight had drained from her, leaving only a shell of the smug, self-assured woman who had started this fire, both literal and metaphorical. One of the officers straightened, adjusting his vest. "Now you're done." The cuffs tightened, the door to the squad car yawned open, and Anna was shoved inside, her screams muffled as the door slammed shut behind her. The door of the squad car slammed shut, muffling Anna's wailing screams. Her once commanding voice, so full of entitlement and false accusations, had been reduced to nothing more than panicked, incoherent sobs. The same woman who had confidently tried to frame Diego, who had burned his home to the ground with a smirk on her lips, now sat trembling in the back seat of a police cruiser, powerless. Diego exhaled slowly, the weight of the night pressing against his chest. His house was gone. His memories, his belongings, the life he had built within those walls, nothing more than ash and embers. And yet, for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't the one being blamed. He wasn't the one being dragged away in handcuffs. Justice, for once, hadn't turned a blind eye. The lead officer turned to him, his expression still hard, still professional. But there was something else there now: acknowledgement. "Sir, we're going to need a full statement from you. Do you wish to press charges?" Diego didn't even have to think. "Absolutely." The officer nodded. "Good. Because she's looking at serious time for this. Arson, false police report, resisting arrest, and assaulting an officer. She won't be talking her way out of this one." From inside the car, Anna's muffled sobs turned into a sudden, sharp wail. "You can't do this to me," she shrieked, slamming her fists against the glass. "I didn't do anything wrong. It's not my fault. He provoked me." No one was listening. The neighborhood had come alive. Residents whispering among themselves, shaking their heads, murmuring words of disbelief and satisfaction. Phones were still raised, still recording. This was history, justice caught in real time. A moment that would not be rewritten or twisted into something it wasn't. An older man, someone Diego had barely spoken to before, clapped him on the shoulder. "Damn shame about your house, son," he said gruffly, shaking his head. "But I'll tell you what, this was long overdue." Diego let out a short breath, part laugh, part exhaustion. "Yeah," he murmured. "Yeah, it was." The officers started wrapping up the scene, coordinating with the fire department as they worked to contain what little remained of his home. It was over. The worst had happened, and yet, somehow, Diego felt lighter. He turned to one of the neighbors still holding up a phone. "You got all of that?" The man smirked, nodding. "Every second." Diego nodded slowly, his mind already spinning ahead. This wouldn't just disappear. Not this time. Anna had counted on her lies being stronger than the truth. But she had underestimated something much more powerful. A neighborhood that refused to stay silent. As the last of the sirens faded into the night, as the remnants of his life smoldered behind him, Diego stood tall, unbroken. He had lost a house, but he had won something far more important. Justice. And that was a victory worth everything. As the last police cruiser disappeared down the street, the night finally exhaled, leaving behind nothing but the smoldering ruins of Diego's home, and the quiet hum of justice settling into place. The flames had been extinguished, but their scars remained blackened wood, crumbling walls, the faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air. It should have felt like devastation. A total loss. But Diego didn't feel lost. He stood among the embers of what had once been his life, inhaling the crisp, smoke-tinged air, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. Anna was gone. Her lies had collapsed under the weight of the truth, and this time, there was no escaping it. No twisting the story. No playing the victim. Not anymore. A slow clap echoed from the sidewalk. Diego turned to see Mrs. Carter, her frail hands coming together in measured applause, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "Took long enough," she murmured. Diego chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, it did." Around him, neighbors lingered, whispering, exchanging glances, some offering nods of quiet respect. He wasn't invisible to them anymore. He wasn't just another face in the neighborhood, a man they only noticed when it was convenient. Tonight had changed that. They had seen what happened. They had spoken up. And for once, the world had listened. A younger man, the same one who had live-streamed the entire thing, walked up, phone still in hand. "This is already blowing up online," he said, shaking his head. "Dude, you just made history." Diego let out a breath. History? Maybe. Or maybe this was just the beginning. He turned back to the wreckage of his home, his hands slipping into his pockets. He had lost everything, every physical thing that had ever mattered to him. But things could be replaced. Walls could be rebuilt. Memories lived beyond the ashes. Justice, though? That was something you couldn't buy, couldn't fabricate, couldn't twist into something else. Tonight, it had stood its ground. And that alone made all the difference. One of the officers approached him again. "You got a place to stay?" Diego nodded. "I'll figure it out. I always do." He turned back toward the street, away from the ruins, away from the past. The night stretched ahead of him, open and endless. And for the first time in his life, it felt like something new. A beginning.